I've been playing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Splintered Fate off and on for a couple months, and they just released a DLC for it last month. If you're after a super deep experience, I don't think this game will quite do that for you. But if you're after just plain, simple action roguelite fun, or you want a fun co-op Turtles game, I think Splintered Fate fits that bill quite well. So let's get into it. If I wanted to be as concise as possible, I would describe Splintered Fate as Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles meets Hades. It's an action roguelite that clearly draws on Hades and has similar overall gameplay. But of course, it has its own twists and characters as well. You play as the 4 turtles, each of whom have 4 abilities. They each have a basic attack, a special attack, a tool, and a dodge. Instead of being on cooldown, the ability and the special attack are both charged by using your basic attack. This felt like a nice differentiating factor from that standard action roguelite formula, and it forces you to stay engaged and use your basic melee attack as opposed to just running away and waiting on cooldowns. When I think Turtles games, I think of classic beat-em-ups, so the forced basic attacks fit that quite well. A couple of quirks of the combat that are worth mentioning. First, the game has heavy-handed auto-aiming. Along with that, most or maybe all of the characters' basic attacks have some baked-in movement if you aren't right on top of the enemy. This game was originally a mobile game, so it makes sense from that perspective, and just making sure you're actually on your target and hitting them. And for the most part, the style works. But it does cause some occasional friction with aiming some of the rare ranged abilities, and when the forced movement unintentionally brings you into damaging AoEs. And on that note, enemy attacks were all very clearly telegraphed, with colorful AoEs corresponding to what enemy is doing them. This makes the game feel very arcadey, but it also helps with dodging and navigating rooms that can get very cluttered. The dodge itself has a short cooldown, but you can also have multiple stacks that allow you to change dodges together or dodge multiple times before waiting for that cooldown. There are occasional hitbox or attack timing quirks that could be cleaned up a little bit, but by and large, its core combat is smooth, responsive, and just fun action roguelike gameplay. In terms of your runs, you clear rooms of enemies and then move on to the next room. Enemies spawn in waves that you clear in succession. You clear a total of 4 areas. Each room have their own mini-bosses and final boss. You never choose the reward of the room ahead, but you do always get multiple reward choices at the end of each room. And this includes cross-run currencies that we'll talk about later. Scrap that is used at the merchant, increased health, temporary buffs, and powers. The main buildcrafting rewards are a choice between those powers, which are a functional equivalent of Hades boons. These powers give various buffs and passive effects. There are 3 slots for attack, dodge, and special attack or tool, and each of those can only hold 1 upgrade. But you can hold an unlimited number of additional passive powers. There are also a lot of passive powers that buff your attack, like ones that add flat water damage on hit that don't take up that attack slot. Because of that, those power slot limits never felt particularly limiting. These powers can also be leveled up, and there are a lot of synergistic powers and rare legendary powers that synergize across boon types. Occasionally, you can also replace your starting tool for a different one as well. Outside of that, there are also mastery upgrades that offer more generic buffs like increased damage to shielded enemies or increased attack size. You can also draw inspiration from other turtles, basically getting their inherent passive effects as upgrades. I think the build crafting here is very familiar, but it works well enough. You rarely get super overpowered builds, but there's still a lot of fun synergies to explore across the 6 or 7 upgrade categories. For example, a water-focused build can deal extra water damage on each hit and slow or stun enemies, while an Ultron lightning-focused build can focus on chaining lightning between enemies and stacking effects that trigger additional lightning damage. They also have a powerful combo effect that makes stunning enemies deal a lot of extra damage. Again, there's something groundbreaking here with this build crafting, but I think the different upgrade categories all have some nice different focuses that also synergize differently with the base kits of the different turtles. Another build crafting element comes in the form of artifacts, which are equivalent to keepsakes in Hades. These can be equipped before your run, or also swapped out each time you visit the merchant. Broadly, there's 1 artifact for each upgrade type, like an ooze artifact giving you an ooze upgrade next, and there are also some more general artifacts as well that have more niche effects, like a blanket chance to dodge an attack, or another artifact that increases scrap gain from certain enemies. In the base game, I found these artifacts to be quite functional, but a little uncreative at times. It always felt like it did the same choice of doing one at the start that helped with currency game, then doing the build crafting ones in the middle, and then finally doing the dodge or revive relic for the final boss. So as a whole, build crafting and gameplay wise, Splintered Fate is fun. It does all of those core elements well, it allows for nice build crafting, and it feels fun to master as you learn enemies and timing those dodges. But it certainly feels like a more streamlined experience compared to games like Hades that clearly inspired it. That's good for approachability, that's good for getting into the game, but it also feels like the skill ceiling is lower than other games in the genre. The real selling point of Splintered Fate, though, gameplay-wise, is the co-op. The game has both local and online co-op with both public and private lobbies. Because the game has a lot lower skill floor, it's probably a great roguelite to play with someone who's newer to the space or just plays fewer games in general. It's a great simple arcade-like fun in co-op. That said, the game definitely feels tuned with co-op in mind. I played this game mostly solo, and for the most part, that's fine. But as you get to higher difficulties, rooms often have a ton of enemies spawn at once. And to my knowledge and co-op experience, there isn't that much scaling based on the number of players. This means that more players allows for much easier aggro splitting. Think, for example, one enemy focusing on each of 4 players versus 4 enemies focusing on just one player. This is important because I kind of stopped enjoying this game at the hardest difficulties when playing solo because you have to start dodging so often, and it feels like you have a very limited attack window between those dodges. That dodge to attack ratio gets way off. But if you play co-op, that particular friction point and balance feels smoothed over, which makes the co-op experience better. Also, it's just nice having both online and couch co-op in the same game because that feels pretty rare these days. UI-wise, this game definitely feels like a mobile game UI first, which, again, it was. It's never that hard to navigate or anything, but there are occasional times when inputs don't register as they should, so I had to press a button multiple times or something like that. This was never during actual combat or gameplay, only during reward selection and things like that. So, in other words, it never affected the actual gameplay, but it made menus feel clunky at times. There were a couple other smaller things too, like my mouse not disappearing when I was using my controller. But outside of that, the base game was pretty bug-free and ran very smoothly. I also played Splintered Fate 90% on Steam Deck, and it runs great there. I actually think this game might be better suited for Steam Deck than it is for full screen, which, again, given that it was originally a mobile game, that makes sense. Splintered Fate was really great for those short sessions while I was traveling. Now let's talk about variety and randomness in Splintered Fate. First, the base game has the 4 turtles that you can play as. In addition to their different core movesets, they also have different starting passives, which lead them better to synergize with certain builds. For example, Raphael has increased base crit chance, which also synergizes with certain fire upgrades that interact with that crit chance. They also have different balances of offensive and defensive abilities, with Leonardo starting with a tool that gives him a brief invulnerability period. I think the turtles all feel nicely different and serve as some good run-to-run variety. I had a great time trying them all and learning the different quirks of their build crafting. I've already talked about the basics of that build crafting, but RNG-wise, I think this game does okay, but not amazing. There's some good counter RNG measures, like relics that can force certain upgrade types. You can also almost always choose to take a different reward instead of a power, like increased health or more scrap, for example. At the same time, though, it feels like what category of power you get is often decided by just what the run happens to give you. Once you get a power of one type, the game keeps giving you more and more of that same type of power. There's still plenty of choice and flexibility, including rerolls with each upgrade type, but I would also have multiple runs in a row where it felt like I basically just ran back to back the same 2 broad power types for my build, even though, of course, the specific upgrades were different. Again, this can be solved a bit with those build relics. You can force different build types, but I think this problem also arises because there's only 6 or 7 power types, and because of that, you're just going to see some repetition run to run. On the enemy side of things, I think Splintered Fate does a good job variety-wise. You have 4 main factions of enemies, all of which are different units that have their own quirks and their own movesets. Broadly, each area has different possibilities for which enemies spawn, but there's still some run-to-run variety, with enemies occasionally spawning in earlier areas or getting slightly different enemy variants run-to-run. Some areas also have different factions fighting each other, which is a nice little twist. Probably the best place enemy variety-wise in Splintered Fate comes in the mini-bosses. Each area has probably 4 or 5 different possible mini-bosses. They're mostly just upgraded versions of normal elite enemies, but it was nice to have some gameplay variety there anyway. The final boss of each area is fixed, but they all have different variants as well that change their moveset a little bit and make them call on different allies. These bosses are still mostly the same across variants, but those small differences felt nice to increase that run-to-run variety just a little bit. And on the note of bosses, I enjoyed them all. They had some nice variety, and they were also all very learnable, including the final boss, which was almost a little too easy to master. So as a whole, I think build crafting wise, this game has a nice mix of RNG that you can't control and things that you can control. But the smaller number of upgrade types can make your general type or category of build feel a little more repetitive than I would like. The enemy variety, on the other hand, is good, and there's some clear choices here and there developers made that add some meaningful changes run to run. Like a lot of elements in Splintered Fate, this RNG variety is good and functional, but it's nothing groundbreaking. Splintered Fate is a roguelite with a large amount of progression, and all of that progression is vertical progression, aka upgrades that make you stronger run to run. The only arguable horizontal progression system comes in the form of unlocking new artifacts for future runs. These are mostly unlocked by just playing the game, but some require certain challenges, like beating the final boss or beating a specific boss on her challenge mode, which we'll get to in a second. As I mentioned earlier, some of these artifacts can be used to force certain build types. You can get all those build-centered artifacts very quickly. Otherwise, most of the progression in this game comes in the form of two currencies and their respective upgrade trees. Dragon coins are the first currency. These give you more pure power upgrades. For example, these can increase your base health, increase your attack damage, or other more niche effects, like increasing the passive and inspiration boost for each different turtle. Notably, some of these upgrades require certain goals or achievements before being able to buy them, or in order to keep upgrading something past a certain tier. Some of these require you to have beaten a certain boss, but some of them also require turtle-specific achievements, notably either beating the middle boss with each turtle or clearing runs with each turtle at a certain difficulty level. I quite like the synergies of a more standard resource upgrade tree, where you can buy the upgrades you want, the ones you prioritize, with an achievement-based system, especially how in this game it forces you and rewards you for trying out all the different characters. The other main currency in this game is dream tokens. These allow you to buy upgrades in a separate upgrade tree. Unlike the dragon tree that gives you more straight buffs, the dream tokens allow for better RNG and resource gain. For example, upgrades include a chance to get level 2 instead of level 1 turtle powers, or a chance to get 2 upgrades at once instead of just 1. These dream tokens can also be used to upgrade your artifacts for more powerful effects. Altogether, these two upgrade trees adds a massive amount of cross-run vertical progression, and a player with full upgrade trees will feel much more powerful than a player that has 0. That being said, I don't think this game feels bad to play with an empty upgrade tree, with the exception of the dodges. Having at least one dodge charge upgrade makes the game feel a lot better, and having only one dodge charge feels notably worse than having multiple. But other than that, you generally play pretty similar regardless of how many upgrades you have. You're just a lot weaker and have worse RNG for your builds. Splintered Fate does unfortunately have one of my roguelite progression pet peeves though. During each run, reward choices will often have you choose between one of those two cross-run currencies and a within-run buff, like turtle power. Similarly, while most artifacts impact gameplay, there are a couple that buff those two progression currencies and how much of those you gain. I always hate that feeling of having to choose between within-run power and cross-run progression. It feels like I'm either sacrificing fun to get faster progression, or I'm sacrificing efficiency and unlock speed instead. Basically, do I want current fun or more future fun? And because Splintered Fate has a ton of unlocks to grind, and you're offered this choice quite repeatedly, it feels particularly annoying here. Ultimately though, you are given the choice, so if you don't want to engage with that system, you don't have to. Outside of that explicit choice where you have to choose either say dragon coins or a turtle power for example, sometimes Splintered Fate also has currency nudges, like choose the specific water power out of all the options to get a couple extra dragon coins on top. I think this kind of nudge system is much better because it's encouraging you to try different builds rather than making you choose to either have more build or faster progression. That nudge can also be scraps, so it can be a nudge of within run power as well. The difficulty levels in Splintered Fate are also pretty unique and interesting. Unlike basically every other roguelite that has difficulty levels, you don't choose your level at the start. Instead, there are two difficulty systems you can choose to engage with during the run itself. The first are portals of power, and these take two forms. There are basic ones at the start of each area that give flat buffs to enemies' health and damage in exchange for increased currency gain. The other portals you find within each areas give specific debuffs, like halving your healing or making enemies' attacks bigger. These are more similar to Ascension levels in Slay the Spire. Because you find these portals during your run, as opposed to picking at the start, you can adjust your difficulty level as you progress. You can start out planning to take all these portals, but if you don't like certain debuffs, you can just choose to not take them. Or if your build's off to a good start and you're playing really well, you can take more portals than you originally planned to keep ramping up that challenge and corresponding reward. If you refuse to take enough portals, or you refuse certain portals, you stop getting them. So you can't just take one portal before the final boss and get that reward. The other difficulty system comes in the form of gauntlet challenges, which are essentially hard mode versions of all the bosses and mini bosses. Before each of these fights, you can choose to fight the normal version or the gauntlet version for increased rewards. The gauntlet bosses usually have both increased stats and additional movesets. Even more than the portals of power, I like this adjustability right before the boss. You can add an extra challenge, extra reward if you're feeling up to it and doing really well. Or you can face the normal mode boss if you're not feeling too hot or the run's not going well. It's a nice risk-reward choice right there. Notably, some difficulty levels are necessary to beat in order to unlock certain upgrades in that Dragon Coin skill tree, as I kind of alluded to earlier. As a whole, I like this difficulty system. It's a nice mix of different systems with general enemy buffs, specific debuffs, and harder, more unique boss fights. It just feels unique in how you can titrate your difficulty during your run based on how well you're doing and how you're feeling. It's worth noting that I don't think the base game is very challenging, which again helps with that approachability that I talked about earlier, but it also means I climb these difficulty levels very quickly. And the game kind of falls apart with some of those harder gauntlet bosses or if you take too many portals. Mostly, some of those harder levels come with a lot of enemies spawning at once, and that can create a problem where you're getting too many attacks at once, you're being constantly attacked, you have to always dodge, and you can't get your own attacks in. And as I explained earlier, that's especially bad as a solo player. So while I like these difficulty systems a lot, I just don't think this game is designed for truly challenging runs for solo players. Now let's talk about the story in Splintered Fate. The game actually has a surprising amount of story. You're playing as the four turtles, who are on a mission to save Master Splinter, who is kidnapped by Shredder, or so it seems at first. Along the way, you uncover new magical forces, creating chaos, as well as meeting a lot of other classic turtle characters. The game is fully voice acted, with lots of brief dialogue interactions before boss fights or after getting to certain objectives, for example. There are also extended dialogues with lore explanations for all of the in-game roguelite mechanics. You have long chats with the merchant character, and long chats with a new character that offers those portals of power, one of the two difficulty systems in the game. I loved how much effort went into explaining all of these very basic gameplay mechanics story-wise. I also felt that this game really embodied the Turtles' personality, how I remember them. The story also progresses quite nicely, although at a certain point, after you get enough wins, it reaches a kind of partially unsettled, unsatisfying ending, but fair enough for a roguelike game. I think this game is definitely made to appeal to existing Turtle fans as opposed to creating new Turtle fans. I've always liked Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I watched some of the movies, I played some of the games, but I was never a hardcore fan. With that in mind, I know a lot of characters in this game, but I definitely don't know all of them. And the game does a poor job of introducing those characters. And I really noticed that for those characters I was not familiar with, and arguably am still not familiar with. There are no lore entries, or really anything to explain who these people are, outside of a very brief introduction. This game is presumably some alternative canon, if Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles even have a canon, but it also doesn't really evolve any existing characters. And because of that, it doesn't really matter if you don't have any of their backgrounds. So Splintered Fate ultimately delivers a satisfying narrative explanation for all the roguelite mechanics, while also being set in this fleshed out existing universe with existing characters. That charm deepened the experience for me, but ultimately, it's still a beat 'em up type of game where you kill a bunch of enemies and it's gameplay first and foremost. Last month, Splintered Fate came out with its first DLC, Casey Jones and the Junkyard Jam. This DLC adds a new character, Casey Jones, in a new area, which is the Junkyard with punk frogs. That's the jam. Casey Jones is a great character addition. He's a hockey player, car enthusiast, and vigilante. He's a purely offensive-focused character, so he has none of the CCE, utility, or movement that's built into the base kits of the other four turtles. Instead, he gets a unique range special attack, the only ranged ability in the game outside of those tools, and he gets a focus on breaking enemies' armor, which allows you to deal more damage as a team. He's also a slower, heavy hitter character in general. I quite like the self-comboing that's present in his kit, with your range special giving your next attack an automatic final strike. Lots of upgrades or powers in this game interact with that final strike specifically, so being able to trigger more of those more reliably just allow for some more fun build crafting. I think he's either my first or second favorite character in this game so far, though he's definitely less forgiving than some of the others because of that purely offensive focused. He also comes with his own Dragon Coin progression upgrades like the other turtles do, meaning you can get his passives on other turtles and you can upgrade them as well, assuming that you meet the requirements. The Junkyard itself serves as an alternative path to the third area in the game. Enemies-wise, it focuses more heavily on the punk frogs, with the mini-boss and final boss being punk frog characters. I quite like both these fights, and the final boss especially felt like a meaningfully different encounter, with the boss's moveset feeling unique compared to the rest of the bosses. The mini-boss here also felt a lot more fleshed out than the other mini-bosses in this game, who are usually variants of existing elite enemies. So she feels more akin to a normal boss in that sense. Unfortunately, I haven't encountered any mini-boss or final boss variants yet, so I wish they had those. But I think in terms of the actual quality of both encounters, they make up for it. Along with already being variants or alternatives to the base path and the base bosses, I think not having variants is forgivable. Outside of the bosses, though, the basic enemies are the exact same enemies as in the base game, but with a new punk theme. You also fight a higher proportion of punk frogs in this area, unsurprisingly, but it's the same frogs as before to the best of my knowledge. I think this is another miss. Adding some more types of enemies or new punk frogs would have been a great way to add some more variety and more value to this DLC. I do still like the ambiance and environment of the junkyard, though, with this messy, musical, and punk theme and these entertaining enemy reskins. The final gameplay element that's added in this DLC are 5 new artifacts. I quite like these new artifacts, and I think they address some gaps that are present in the base roster of artifacts that are missing a little creativity. Most of these new artifacts are scaling artifacts, so they give some additional benefit as you clear rooms and bosses, and some of them have a nice co-op element as well. For example, one artifact gives you and your team increased health each time you clear a boss. I think these artifacts serve as great all-rounders. They're also artifacts you might want to keep for longer periods of time for those scaling effects, whereas in the base game, I never felt a reason to not use a build-focused artifact at some point because of how the artifacts worked. In other words, these new artifacts just create some more viable build choices. A couple odds and ends about the DLC. If you're playing online co-op, only one player needs to actually own the DLC for everyone to access it. So that's a great addition. The DLC also comes with some great new variety for the challenge or debuff variety of the Portals of Power. I think this might be a free update to the base game, but I couldn't find any confirmation of that. Also, the DLC has a lot of fun short dialogue interactions and a similar, modest, but evolving narrative with full voice acting. I will also note that after the DLC launched, I had notably more bugs than previously, like menus acting buggy, things like that. I mostly played right around the patch launch, so it's possible that a lot of these are fixed now. Altogether, I think this DLC is fairly good quality-wise. It's good content that improves the game, but the actual amount of content, while not minimal, is just not that much. Because of that, it's definitely not a must-buy. But if you're enjoying the base game of Splintered Fate, or if you just really want to see Casey Jones or more punk frogs, I think it's worth grabbing at some point. They do also call this their first DLC, so they've at least hinted at more DLC in the future. I wouldn't be surprised if they keep adding more alternative paths with time. So what's my verdict on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Splintered Fate? I like it. It's just good, simple fun, and I had a great time playing it. It has fun combat, fun builds, and fun bosses. I loved revisiting the turtle setting for the first time in quite a few years, and I enjoyed the way they explained even mundane gameplay elements with that story. Splintered Fate also particularly shines as a casual co-op game. At the same time, the game has a lot of limitations. While it's a very approachable roguelite, it just lacks the depth and creativity of some other games in the genre. The gameplay is simpler, the builds feel good but somewhat limited, and some of those higher difficulty levels just really don't feel good solo due to being spammed with attacks and AoEs to dodge. The game also has heavy vertical progression, which is a matter of personal preference. With all of that, I give Splintered Fate a soft recommendation, particularly if you're an existing Turtles fan, if you want co-op, or if you want a more approachable action roguelite in general. There's just a simple fun factor that shines through a lot of those limitations of the game. But because of all those limitations, this game is definitely not a must-buy, especially at $30 for the base game, which is high for the roguelite space. Huge shout out to all of our channel members for helping support the channel. Please like this video to help me out in the algorithm, and thanks for watching.